Castles of medieval noblemen and knights, built for defense in a time of political division and almost constant warfare. The medieval towns and cities that prospered with the growth of trade during the later Middle Ages. The towering medieval cathedrals bearing witness to the religious faith that helped to unite Western Europe and make the medieval period an age of faith. Many of these buildings remain today, symbols of the Middle Ages, a period of 1,000 years from the disastrous fall of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the modern world. To see how the medieval world came into being, we need to look back to the time of the Roman Empire. By the year 180 AD, that empire reached to the northern border of what is now England and included parts of Africa and Asia. The laws and customs of Rome had a strong influence in the southern part of the empire, near the Mediterranean Sea, with a large settled population. But conditions in the north were very different, and Roman control was never very secure. Most of those northern lands were forested wilderness. Population was very sparse, because the farming methods of the time could not cope with the moist climate. In these northern lands, the legions of Rome were never able to establish imperial control over the Germanic tribes that the Romans called barbarians. Eventually, the invasion of Roman lands by the barbarian tribes helped to bring about the fall of the Roman Empire. In the year 410 AD, the city of Rome itself was captured and partially destroyed by one of these barbarian tribes, the Visigoths. With the disintegration of the Roman Empire, the first period of the Middle Ages had begun. In the lands once ruled by Rome, political unity had been destroyed. But Rome remained the center of an institution that offered the hope of another kind of unity. The Roman Catholic Church, led by the Pope, would be an important force in a time of political division and rivalry. In Roman Catholic monasteries, scribes copied and preserved the Bible and other writings. Monasteries were the only important centers of learning in Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. And some monks became missionaries, preaching Christianity to the barbarian tribes. Eventually, these invading tribes began to form settlements and civilized communities throughout Western Europe. But the threat of invasion had not ended. One new group of invaders had come originally from the deserts of Arabia. These Muslim cavalry troops began their invasion of Europe in the year 711, and the armies of Western Europe, in order to turn back the Muslim invasion, began to develop their own cavalry troops. These mounted soldiers were the first medieval knights. It was an effective method of fighting, but it created a new problem. To maintain a horse and to provide a knight with riding gear, armor, and weapons, all this was very expensive. A man could become a knight only if he had a source of income, and because of this, the appearance of the medieval knight was closely related to the development of the feudal system. In the early Middle Ages, wealth and power were based on the holding of land, farmland that could provide an income from its crops. Under the feudal system, a ruler who claimed control of large tracts of land would grant the use of part of his land to others, who were called his vassals, in exchange for a pledge of military service. So a vassal became a landlord, and with the income from his farms, a landlord could equip himself as a knight. As the feudal system developed, it became very complicated. One man might be the vassal of several others, and at the same time have several vassals of his own. A bishop or other high-ranking churchman was often a landholder, and that meant that he was sometimes a warrior as well. After the year 900, landlords began to build castles for defense against attack. Clustered around the castle were the cottages that formed the castle village. The cottages were the homes of the peasant farmers or serfs who worked the land. Living in the shadow of the fortified castle, the villagers had some hope of safety during an invasion or during one of the many small wars that often broke out between rival landholders. Beyond the village were the fields. After the year 900, much of the land in the northern part of Western Europe was gradually changed from wilderness into farmland. It happened because of the introduction of a more efficient type of plow called the moldboard plow. For the peasant farmers of the early Middle Ages, both men and women, life was filled with drudgery, poverty, and insecurity. In exchange for protection in wartime and the right to raise crops for themselves, they had to give part of their harvest to their landlord and work for him in other ways as well. During the early medieval period, the people of the castle village had almost no contact with the outside world. There was very little trade with other communities because travel was dangerous. But gradually, as the spread of knighthood provided better defense, the invasions of Western Europe ended, and life began to be a bit more secure. By the year 1095, the armies of Western Europe were ready for new adventures beyond their frontiers. The most dramatic of these adventures were the Crusades, armed expeditions to the east that attempted to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslim invaders who had conquered it. There were several separate crusades over a period of more than 200 years. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem, but this early victory was followed by eventual defeat. The Muslims regained control of the Holy Land. But as the armies returned from each crusade, they brought with them many new ideas gained from their contact with the people of the East. And the returning ships brought cargoes of silks and spices and many other products that were new to the people of Western Europe. Along the routes of the Crusades, cities and towns began to develop into trading centers. The cities of Italy, especially Venice and Genoa, were the first to benefit. In the southern part of Western Europe, several cities had survived the fall of the Roman Empire, and the growth of trade was bringing them new prosperity. Farther north, new towns were established at strategic points along trade routes. In the northern part of Western Europe, city life had been almost unknown until about the year 1000. One of these newly established northern cities was Ghent, in what is now Belgium. Many of the buildings constructed in medieval times are still standing. A customs house where merchants paid taxes on imported goods. A bank building. Medieval trade led to the beginning of the modern system of banking. And there are the guild halls that were used as headquarters by various craft guilds. As cities and towns grew, they became centers of manufacturing as well as trade, and a guild was an association either of merchants or of craftsmen. This is the town hall in Ghent, the center of the medieval city government. The growth of self-governing towns and cities was part of a pattern of change that led to the decline of the feudal system. Many medieval towns had begun as castle villages, under the authority of the noblemen who lived in the castle. But eventually, as the towns grew more wealthy and powerful, the people won the right to set up their own town government. townspeople formed a new middle class between nobles and serfs. By the year 1200, the growth of trade had brought greater prosperity to Western Europe. Population was increasing, and more peasant farmers were moving into towns and cities to find work in the growing manufacturing industry. In a medieval town, all the craftsmen who produced the same type of product lived and worked on the same street and belonged to the same guild. The street of the leather tanners, or the street of the spur makers, or the fishermen, or the coal merchants. Most of the craft guilds accepted only men and boys as members, but a few guilds accepted women. In particular, the medieval cloth industry provided jobs for many women. And women shopkeepers were not uncommon. The growth of manufacturing and trade had helped to improve the lives of most of the people of the Middle Ages. But for many years, townspeople still faced the threat of invasions, and medieval towns were surrounded by walls and heavily fortified. Like the gate of a castle, a city gate might have an iron portcullis that could be lowered as a defense against an enemy attack. But eventually, toward the end of the Middle Ages, as the threat of invasion diminished, some cities began to expand well beyond their fortified walls. And by this time, the growing prosperity of the cities had helped to produce an important new development in medieval architecture. In the very center of many cities, towering above every other building, stood a great cathedral built in the style we call Gothic. In cities throughout Western Europe, many Gothic cathedrals were constructed between the years 1150 and 1300. This was the period we call the High Middle Ages, when medieval prosperity and achievement reached its peak. One of the finest examples of medieval architecture is the cathedral of the town of Chartres in France. Its tall spires create a lofty, soaring effect made possible by the building methods introduced by Gothic architects and symbolizing the aspirations of medieval religion. Within the cathedral, tall pointed arches surround a vast open space. The roof is supported by these arches rather than by the walls, and this makes possible the great stained glass windows that brighten the interior with shafts of colored light. Stained glass is only one of the many forms of art that embellish the cathedral. There is lavish use of sculpture as well. Statues representing saints of the church, or people and themes from the Bible. These themes had been used for hundreds of years, and yet sculpture like this represents the beginning of something new. The figures are more realistic and lifelike than earlier medieval sculpture. By the time of the High Middle Ages, when the great Gothic cathedrals were being built, medieval life had begun to change in many ways. And this pattern of change would gradually bring the Middle Ages to a close. There were changes in education. Universities were being established, the forerunners of our modern colleges and universities. A new philosophy called humanism was beginning to change people's outlook on the world and human life. There were changes in the balance of political power. For many years, the Pope had asserted his authority over political rulers. But by the year 1300, these political rulers were gaining greater authority, and the power of the Pope was declining. And the feudal system, which had dominated most of Western Europe in the year 1000, also continued to decline as national governments became stronger, beginning the formation of the nations that we know today in Western Europe. Even though these new nations were ruled by kings and queens, they had national legislatures and judiciary systems, the forerunners of the democratic forms of government that developed many years later. By the year 1500, the Middle Ages had come to a close, and the modern world was beginning to take shape, based in part on the achievements of the late medieval period. Some of these achievements are reflected in the medieval buildings that still stand in many parts of Western Europe. But, more important, many of our institutions of government, education, finance, and industry can be traced back to the foundations laid by the people of the medieval world.